The Smiling Plague of 1888. Prologue. The Sound of Dying. In the winter of 1888, in the isolated mining town of Ravens Hollow, Colorado, a sound began to echo through the snowy streets that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. It wasn't the cry of a wild animal, or the whistle of the mine shaft, or the howl of the wind through the pine forests that surrounded the town. It was laughter. Uncontrollable, manic, and utterly joyless laughter that seemed to suck all warmth from the air, and it was always invariably the last sound a person made. This is the story of the Smiling Plague, a medical anomaly that defied all logic and reason, and the terrible secret that festered beneath the snow and ice, waiting to be exposed. It's a tale that begins with a mystery wrapped in horror, and ends with a truth more disturbing than any supernatural curse. The events that unfolded in Ravens Hollow would challenge everything the medical community thought they knew about illness, and everything the townspeople thought they knew about themselves. The story survives today through the personal journals of Dr. Alistair Finch, the town's only physician, which were discovered nearly 50 years after the events in an old medical trunk. These fragile pages, filled with precise handwriting that grows increasingly frantic as the days pass, tell a story of scientific curiosity turning to horror, and finally to a grim understanding of the human capacity for both evil and redemption. Chapter 1. The Arrival of the Unthinkable. Our story properly begins with Dr. Alistair Finch, a man who had traded a promising career in Boston for the quiet isolation of Ravens Hollow. He was running from something. His journals hint at a tragedy involving a patient back east, a failure that had shattered his confidence. The mining town, with its straightforward injuries and common ailments, seemed like a place where he could do no harm. He was a man of science, of reason, a follower of the latest medical advancements. He believed in what he could see under a microscope, what he could measure and quantify. He was about to have every one of his beliefs systematically dismantled. The first case was Old Man Hemlock, the town's recluse. He lived in a tumble-down shack on the edge of the cemetery, a man who preferred the company of the dead to the living. When a concerned neighbor, worried by the unusual silence from the normally cantankerous old man, forced his way inside, he found Hemlock on the floor of his kitchen. His body was contorted in a bizarre position, back arched, hands clenched into rigid claws. But the most horrifying thing was his face. A wide, grotesque smile was stretched across his features, so extreme it seemed his lips might tear. His eyes, however, were wide with what could only be described as pure terror. The town dismissed it as a strange but isolated tragedy. Perhaps the old fool had finally drunk himself to death, they said. Maybe he'd had a stroke that left him with that peculiar rictus grin. Dr. Finch, performing a cursory examination, found nothing immediately suspicious. He noted the death as cause unknown, possibly apoplexy, and thought little more of it. But a week later it happened again. This time the victim was Joe Pembroke, a young, strong miner in the prime of his life. He was in the town's only saloon, the Silver Nugget, celebrating a lucky find in the mine. One moment he was laughing normally with his friends. The next his laughter changed. It became louder, sharper, devoid of any real humor. It was a harsh, barking sound that went on, uninterrupted. He laughed as he clutched the table, his knuckles white. He laughed as he slid to the floor, his body convulsing. He laughed until he vomited, and then he laughed through the vomit, the sound becoming a wet, choking gurgle. The other patrons watched in frozen horror as the life drained from his eyes. That same terrible, fixed smile etched onto his face even in death. This time, Dr. Finch performed a thorough autopsy. He opened Joe Pembroke up under the flickering light of a kerosene lamp in his makeshift surgery. He examined the stomach for poison. He inspected the brain for signs of hemorrhage or lesion. He checked the heart, the lungs, the liver. He found nothing. No toxins, no infections, no structural abnormalities. The man was, by all anatomical accounts, perfectly healthy. The only thing wrong with him was the simple, impossible fact that he had literally laughed himself to death. Panic, quiet at first, began to ripple through Ravens Hollow. A contagion of madness seemed to be sweeping through the town. The miners, superstitious by nature, began to whisper of a curse. They spoke of the laughing demon of the mountains, a legendary creature from Ute folklore that was said to steal a man's soul through his joy. But Dr. Finch, a man of logic and evidence, didn't believe in demons or curses. He believed in cause and effect. There was a reason for this, a scientific explanation, and he was determined to find it. In the weeks that followed, the plague established its grim rhythm. A third victim fell, then a fourth. A woman named Mary Ann Holt, a seamstress with no connection to the miners, was found smiling her death smile over her sewing machine. A shopkeeper's son, a boy of no more than 12, died laughing in the schoolhouse. The town was paralyzed by fear. The sound of any laughter, even the innocent giggle of a child, now sent people scrambling indoors, their faces pale with dread. The town council, led by the stern, imposing mine owner Silas Croft, held an emergency meeting. Croft was a man who had built his empire from nothing, a pragmatist who valued order and productivity above all else. He saw the plague not as a tragedy, but as a threat to his operations. He argued for a policy of strict quarantine. The sick, or those showing the slightest sign of the laughter, were to be isolated in a barn on the outskirts of town. Their belongings were to be burned. He wanted to build a wall of fear around the problem, to contain it through brute force. Dr. Finch argued against this. From his careful notes, a pattern was beginning to emerge. The plague wasn't spreading like a typical virus. It wasn't moving through households, infecting whole families. It seemed to strike seemingly at random, but always every single victim had some connection, however tangential, to the Crimson Vein mine. They were either miners, family members of miners, or provided services to the mine. This was his first major clue. He began a methodical investigation, interviewing the families of the victims. He was met with a wall of grief, but also with something else, a deep unspoken shame. Widows would not meet his eye. Children, when asked about their fathers, would fall into a stubborn silence. It was as if the entire town was hiding something, a secret so vast and so terrible that it was easier to accept a supernatural plague than to speak of it aloud. He also found active resistance. Silas Croft summoned Finch to his opulent office, which overlooked the main shaft of the mine. The room was a testament to his wealth, filled with fine furniture and specimens of silver ore. "You're scaring people, Doctor," Croft said, his voice low and threatening. "You're asking questions that don't need answering. You're stirring up trouble. This is a medical matter. Find a medical cause. Don't go digging into things that are best left buried." But the more he was warned away, the more convinced Finch became that the answer lay not in a microscope, but in the town's past. The breakthrough, when it came, was from an entirely unexpected quarter. Eliza, Silas Croft's own daughter. Eliza was a stark contrast to her father. Where he was blunt and physical, she was delicate and intellectual. She was a reader, a dreamer, a young woman who felt like a foreigner in her own town. She was also, as Finch would come to learn, deeply empathetic and haunted by vague premonitions she could never quite articulate. She came to his clinic one evening, shrouded in a heavy cloak, her face pale and earnest. She told him of the Ute workers, the few who still labored in the mine, often in the most dangerous roles. They had a name for what was happening. They called it the Umunhonkase, which roughly translated to breath of the mocking spirit. It wasn't a sickness of the body, they said, but a sickness of the soul. It preyed on a guilty conscience, feeding on a secret so heavy it could no longer be contained. The laughter, they believed, was the sound of the secret trying to claw its way out. This was the missing piece. Dr. Finch's theory crystallized. This wasn't a biological plague. It was a psychogenic one, a mass hysteria of the most extreme and lethal kind. The body, unable to contain the psychological trauma, was manifesting it in this physical, catastrophic way. The laughter was a scream of guilt made audible, a pressure valve for a horror that the entire town had collectively suppressed. But what was the secret? What could possibly be so terrible that it could kill a man with the force of his own conscience? The town descended into a state of siege. People stopped gathering. The saloon was empty. The church pews were largely vacant. Every man, woman, and child walked through the snow-covered streets with the wary eyes of a hunted animal, waiting for the laughter to claim them next. The sound of the mine whistle, which had once been the sound of industry and prosperity, was now a mournful dirge. Dr. Finch, armed with Eliza's information and his own mounting evidence, knew he was running out of time. The plague was accelerating. The laughter was becoming more frequent, the deaths piling up. He confronted Silas Croft again, this time not in his office, but in the town square, in front of a gathering of terrified citizens. Eliza stood by his side, a silent testament to the truth that was about to be revealed. "This is not a sickness you can quarantine," Finch shouted, his voice cutting through the cold air. "This is not a germ you can burn. It's inside you, all of you. It's the truth you've been hiding for years, and it's killing you one by one." A murmur ran through the crowd. Silas Croft's face was a mask of fury. "You're a madman, Finch. You're as sick as the rest of them." But then a voice from the crowd spoke up. It was Martha Pembroke, Joe's widow. Her face was ravaged by grief, but her eyes were clear and hard. "He's right," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "It's the cave-in, the one at the Widow's Walk." A collective gasp went through the crowd. It was as if a spell had been broken. The dam of silence, carefully maintained for 5 years, finally burst. The story that tumbled out was more horrifying than any plague. 5 years earlier, there had been a massive cave-in in a section of the Crimson Vein known as the Widow's Walk. The official report, signed by Silas Croft and the town elders, stated that 10 men had died, tragically but instantly. It was a lie. The truth was that 23 men had been trapped. They weren't killed instantly. They were alive. For 2 agonizing days, their voices could be heard through the tons of rock, calling for help, begging for rescue. The entire town had gathered at the mine entrance, listening to the desperate tapping and the faint, ghostly cries of their husbands, fathers, and brothers. Then, the engineers delivered their grim assessment. A second, much larger collapse was imminent. Attempting a rescue would not only be futile, it would likely trigger the collapse and seal the main shaft permanently. The mine, the lifeblood of Raven's Hollow, would be lost forever. The town would face economic ruin. Faced with this impossible choice, Silas Croft and the other foremen made a calculated, monstrous decision. They ordered the rescue operation abandoned. To stabilize the main shaft and save the mine, they made the conscious decision to dynamite the secondary tunnels around the Widow's Walk. They knowingly, deliberately, entombed the 23 men alive. The subsequent explosion not only sealed their tomb, but also provided the convenient cover story of a catastrophic secondary collapse that killed the men instantly. The town was complicit. In exchange for generous compensation from Croft and the promise of continued work, the families agreed to the lie. The miners, terrified of losing their jobs, buried their guilt deep. They collectively decided to forget the sounds of their friends screaming, to pretend they had died a quick and painless death. They buried the truth, and with it, they buried their collective soul. With the secret finally exposed, a profound and eerie silence fell over Raven's Hollow. The fits of laughter ceased almost immediately. The plague, which had claimed 14 lives, vanished as suddenly and inexplicably as it had appeared. There had been no cure, no miracle drug. There had only been confession. Dr. Finch, in his later journals, would try to rationalize the phenomenon. He wrote extensively about the power of the human mind, about how a repressed memory, especially one of such profound moral injury, could manifest physically. He theorized that the guilt and shame, festering in the communal unconscious of the town, had created a kind of psychic poison. The laughter was a hysterical conversion disorder of the most extreme order. The body, unable to process the psychological trauma, had literally created a physical symptom that resulted in death. The smiling plague was the town's conscience, quite literally, killing them. The aftermath was complex. The town was saved from the plague, but it was utterly destroyed by the truth. The social fabric, woven from a web of lies, unraveled completely. Silas Croft was run out of town, his reputation and empire in ruins. The mine, now synonymous with the atrocity, was eventually abandoned. its entrance slowly reclaimed by the mountain. Dr. Finch did not leave. The man who had come to Raven's Hollow to escape his past found a new purpose in its shattered present. He stayed for the rest of his life, tending to the physical and psychological wounds of the survivors. He never fully reconciled the scientific with the spiritual, but he came to accept that there were forces at work in the human psyche that his medical texts could never explain. Eliza Croft, freed from the shadow of her father's sin, became a teacher. She dedicated her life to ensuring that the children of Raven's Hollow were educated in truth and empathy, determined that such a horror would never happen again. She and Dr. Finch remained close friends and allies, bound together by the terrible secret they had helped unearth. The smiling plague of Raven's Hollow remains one of history's most chilling and obscure case studies. It serves as a dark testament to the fact that the human mind and the human conscience are territories far more complex and dangerous than any wilderness. It proves that secrets are not passive things. They have weight and force. When left to fester in the dark, they can become a contagion all their own. A ghost that doesn't haunt a house, but the very soul of a community. The laughter that echoed through Raven's Hollow was not the sound of a demon, but the sound of a truth that could no longer be silenced. A final, fatal scream from a grave the whole town had tried to forget. Epilogue. The echoes in the silence. Years later, long after the last resident had moved away and Raven's Hollow had become a true ghost town, hikers and historians would occasionally visit the site. They would remark on the profound silence that hung over the valley, a silence that felt heavier and more profound than mere absence of sound. Some claimed that on certain still winter nights, if you listened very closely, you could hear it. Not laughter, but something far sadder. The faint, ghostly echo of 23 men still tapping, waiting for a rescue that never came. And perhaps in that eternal silent plea lies the ultimate lesson of the smiling plague, that while secrets can be buried, the truth has a life of its own and it will always find a way to be heard.